We come today to perhaps the bloodiest chapter in the whole Bible, 2 Kings chapter 10. It's almost like reading Macbeth. You remember last time that I introduced you to Jehu, that fast-driving, furious commander of the king's army. The first thing he does when he comes to power was to kill 3 tyrants. We saw that: Jehoram, the king of Israel, Athaliah, king of Judah, and the terrible Jezebel. But he doesn't stop there. He enters into a massive slaughter. Every descendant of the house of Omri, Ahab, and Jezebel is put to death. And when he's finished that, he sets about the prophets of Baal, and by deceit he manages to get all of them into the temple of Baal. Then he surrounds it with his soldiers and sends them in to slaughter them. It's a terrible scene. It's a bit reminiscent of some of what came out of Rwanda 25 years ago. I've never read this chapter in public. I leave you to read it for yourself. Some of the description is quite awful. It's not surprising that very few preachers have ever preached on this chapter. I never have up till now. What can a preacher say out of this? Well, firstly, we need to note that Jehu was fulfilling the will of God. It was God's will for all of these people to be put to death. And we just have to come to terms with that. Secondly, that Jehu had zeal for the Lord. And that's a good thing, isn't it? Although I do get nervous when people are what I would call overzealous. They're in your face all the time. In my experience, those people often tend to burn out like a shooting star that goes across the sky and then dies away. In fact, that's what happens to Jehu. In the end, he turns evil. Zeal for the Lord alone is not enough. I need also to have love for the Lord. I need to know him. It's actually an occupational hazard of preachers that we can go to the scriptures looking for a sermon instead of looking for God. I made it a habit in the ministry of going to see people, ministers that I felt were doing well in the ministry, and just learn from them. I flew all the way up to Johannesburg, especially for a meeting with a Methodist minister called Costas Tathakis. He was one of the most zealous men I've ever met. Well, we talked for an hour or so, and he told me many things. And at the end, I asked the question I always asked. Out of all the things you've told me, is there one secret you would single out for your ministry? Costa hesitated only a moment, and then he looked me in the eye and he said, time for Costa and God. And there it was. Zeal is not enough. Time for Costa and God. But the third and by far the most important thing about Jehu is that Jehu is a picture of the holiness of God. In the vengeance and wrath of Jehu, we see God's abhorrence of human sin. It's really important for us to understand and grasp this. If we don't, we will not appreciate the cross of Christ. In the last 200 years, the world has done everything it can to downgrade the holiness of God and downgrade the seriousness of sin, so that today you will often meet people who will even say there is no such thing as sin. Well, if there's no such thing as sin, there's no need for the cross of Christ. And that is why Satan is pushing this thing so hard. Have you ever wondered why God required Jesus to suffer crucifixion? Wouldn't it have been good enough for him just to be beheaded like John? He would have shed his blood for us. We'd still have been saved, wouldn't we? And I think we would have. And it would have been quick and painless. Couldn't that have been enough? No, God required him to go through the worst form of execution that the Romans could think of, and they were experts. Why did God require that? And I believe the answer is that we may have time and be able to see the enormity of our sin. There is a lovely church in the old city of Jerusalem. We used to love to go there, St. Xavier's Catholic Church, beautiful church. But hanging right above the altar is a life-size crucifix in full color, blood and all. It's really gory. And as a Protestant, my first reaction when I walked in is to recoil from it. But the more I think about it, the more I think there's a point in that. We need to gaze, we need to look, we need to see. We need to sing, I cast my mind to Calvary. And then the chorus, praise the name of the Lord our God. The measure of our praise will be in direct proportion to our understanding of the enormity of our sin. And so we must leave Jehu behind with this comment. Jehu is a picture of the holiness of God. Jesus is a picture of the love of God. Those two aspects of God's nature that are like two sides of a coin, inseparable, immense. And so we turn to chapter 12, and we take our attention away from Israel and across to Judah. What's going on there meantime? Well, we already know that Ahaziah has been killed by Jehu, and there's a gap on the throne. Who's going to take that gap? Well, the answer is, you remember that Jehoram married Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Well, this wicked woman takes her chance and she grabs the throne and makes it her own. Not only that, but she immediately sets about a wholesale slaughter that matches Jehu's and kills off every member of the line of David that she can find. The difference between this slaughter and Jehu's is that Jehu was doing it in obedience to God. Athaliah is doing it in obedience, I believe, to Satan. Satan is already terrified at the prospect of the coming Messiah. And this is the first of his two attempts to stop it by killing off all the innocents. And he so nearly succeeds. There is one left. It's a 1-year-old toddler by the name of Joash. By that slender thread, God's promise to David hangs that he will always have someone on the throne of Judah. And now the story about why Joash survives. It's a wonderful story. I call it The Princess, the Priest, and the Wicked Stepmother. It sounds like a fairy story, doesn't it? But in fact, it's based on solid fact. Athaliah meets her match. And ironically, she meets it in her stepdaughter. Her son Ahaziah had a sister, half-sister, called Jehoshaphat. Now the interesting thing is that Ahaziah, we know, followed in the wicked footsteps of his father. But Jehoshaphat follows in the godly footsteps of her grandfather. Even their names are similar, Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat. Who can say why? I heard a saying once that says, your daddy is in your blood, but your grandpa is in your bones. It's one of my desires to get into the bones of my grandchildren. And she becomes a godly woman. Jehoshaphat marries a priest. In fact, she marries the high priest. It's the only case in the whole of Jewish history that a princess marries a priest. But it's a sign of her godliness. It's not unknown in history. In fact, it happened on the 18th of November 1972 when this, not priest but pastor, married his princess. And the priest and the princess decide that they will hide the 1-year-old boy Joash. They hide him in a secret room in the temple, and there they keep him for 6 long years with only a nurse for company. Just think of that. Talk about lockdown. How can a boy turn out normal in those circumstances? Well, she must have been a most remarkable nurse because he did. And then at the age of 7, the priest and the princess decide the time has come, and they set up their plans. All leave is cancelled for the temple guard, and they set on duty right around the temple fully armed. And then inside the temple, the high priest anoints the 7-year-old boy as king and places a crown on his head. Then he steps back and shouts, God save the king. And the shout is echoed by everyone in the temple. It spreads to the guards and they shout it. It spreads outside and spreads right into the town. And of course Athaliah hears it and she comes rushing up. She can't get in the door of the temple, but she sees through between the guards her 7-year-old grandson standing with a crown on his head and a purple robe. And she wants to murder him. But she can't. The order is given for the soldiers to take her into custody, not to kill her in the temple precincts, but to take her out. And so they take her to the horses' entrance to the palace. And there they slay her. And her blood mingles with the dung of the horses. And so another tyrant falls. Meanwhile in the temple, a 7-year-old boy stands with a crown on his head. I believe that when Frank Retief was teaching lay preachers, he said, whenever you're in the Old Testament, take every opportunity you have to make a fast cross-country journey to Jesus. Well, with Joash, it's not difficult at all. There are so many parallels between Joash and Jesus. Both of them were born during the time of very dangerous monarchs. Both of them survived an attack on the innocents. Both of them showed great wisdom as children. Both of them grew up to have a wonderful ministry. Both of them were crowned to great joy. Now, last week was Ascension Day, and for some reason that one has never grabbed us very much. I think it's because we always see Ascension Day from below, as it were, as the disciples did, and they just watch Jesus taken up into the cloud and disappear, and that's all they see. If we could have seen what happened the other side of those clouds, we'd think differently. As Jesus was received into heaven, and thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000 angels worship, and all the saints who've gone ahead worship, the noise must have been so great that I'm surprised it didn't cause earthquakes on earth. And I've often wondered, what did they sing? Is there a special language in heaven that we will sing? Or are we allowed to use our own earthly language? Because if English was used that day, I think they would have sung "Crown Him with Many Crowns, the Lamb upon the throne." We're going to end by looking at a singing of the last verse of that hymn in Westminster Abbey. And the reason I'm showing it is there you will see the Queen of England, the Prince of Wales, and the third in line to the throne, all standing there singing "Crown Him with Many Crowns," casting their crowns before him, the Lamb upon the throne.